Topic: Tea or Coffee by Fiza Hassan. Mrs. Shirazi's sharp eyes took in the well-manicured lawn and the neat edges of flower beds filled with blooming shrubs in the garden of the large, white-pillared, fashionable house in a posh residential district of Karachi. Hmm, new gardener, she thought. Not bad. Must do something about my garden too. I wonder what she pays him. A babble of female voices met Mrs. Shirazi's ears as a uniformed servant opened the front door for her, and she entered the house. Good, thought the lady who loved to make an entrance. Almost everyone seems to be here. She paused in the doorway, her ample figure taking up most of the space, and adjusted her dupatta on her shoulders, so that the expensive embroidery on her kameez would show to an advantage. "Mrs. Shirazi," shrieked a flabbily pale-skinned woman seated near the door. "There you are, late as usual. I'm so terribly sorry, Mrs. Khan. I really wanted to be here on time, but you see I got held up. The most awful thing has happened." The last sentence had the desired effect. Mrs. Shirazi knew that the whole room was listening, even the women who were pointedly looking the other way and still talking amongst themselves. "Why, Mrs. Shirazi, what has happened?" "You all know my second cousin Sophia, don't you? Well, the Kates broke into her house the day before yesterday." Having assured herself the full attention of everyone in the drawing room, Mrs. Shirazi sank down onto a flower-patterned sofa, piled high with soft cushions, and laid her trendy sunglasses next to a crystal vase on the glass-topped coffee table. "No, really, what happened? Is the family all right?" Mrs. Khan's tremulous voice was all concern. Everyone was listening intently, casting a glance around and satisfied that indeed she had everyone's undivided attention. Mrs. Shirazi started her tale. "Well, Sophia is still in shock. Naturally and understandable, of course. Nobody was hurt, thank God. But they took everything. All the electronics. You know Sophia's husband always has the latest of everything. Her jewelry's worth a couple of million. You know, her new car, everything. Gone. They were in the house for 3 hours. Held the whole family at gunpoint. The children were really terrified. Such a loss. They are very lucky to have escaped unhurt," put in Mrs. Hussain. "I know somebody who lost her husband in a robbery of the same kind. Shot him through the head as they left." "Well, anyway," Mrs. Shirazi, who obviously didn't like the shift in attention, butted in, "Sophia's completely broken, taken to her bread. The doctors prescribed a long list of tranquilizers. Her husband says they are all just a bunch of fancy names and are of no use at all, and that she should snap out of it and attend to the children's needs. Very unfeeling, I must say. He is rather cold, actually. Runs in his family. My parents knew his uncle. I, for one, know I would be devastated if anything like that happened to me." "What? You would be devastated if being cold ran in your family?" There were a few snickers at Mr. Hussein's politely made remark. Mrs. Shirazi's glare would have reduced any of the other women in the room to nothingness. "Yes. Well, not everyone has the sensitivity to be able to feel loss and pain. Some people just don't have it in them, you know." Having put Mrs. Hussain in her place, or so she thought, Mrs. Shirazi turned to her hostess and different conversations started up all over the room once again, mostly centered around the latest flower clothes exhibition. "Oh, Mrs. Khan, I have just noticed. You have got new curtains. They are very nice, I'm sure, but pity that they don't quite match the sofas. Did I tell you that big shop Jewel Palace is offering a 10% discount on all jewelry this week? I thought I should get a few things for my daughter. I know she's only 17 and might not get married for some years, but time flies and it will be so hard buying anything just before her wedding. I must go and see. I've been thinking of getting some new gold bangles for a while now. I'm sick of these old ones. So out of fashion now. Don't you just get tired of old jewelry after a while, Mrs. Shirazi?" At this point, two glass trolleys set with delicate crockery and silver and loaded with delicacies, were wheeled in, and the maid started serving spicy kebabs, light sandwiches, and cream cake. Mrs. Khan prepared to pour the tea. Mrs. Khan, nobody can make kebabs quite like your cook. And this chutney is sublime, one of the ladies remarked appreciatively. Several others agreed. You have no idea how difficult it is to prevent my cook from leaving. Whenever he wants his salary raised, he threatens to go, and I have to agree to his terms because I just can't afford to lose him. What with all the official dinners my husband has to give, I really need a good staff, and he knows some really good recipes. A discussion about recipes ensued, the ladies all trying to outdo one another in originality. The exchange was at its peak when the door opened and the maid showed in another visitor. The plump, well dressed woman who entered had turned very white even with all her makeup. The soft manicured hand that clutched a smart leather purse trembled. Her eyes were wide with shock and glazed with fear. The hostess got up to greet her. Mrs. Nawaz, you are late. That's not at all like you. But I am glad you were able to come. Mrs. Khan went forward and kissed the air next to her visitor's rough cheek. On not receiving any kind of response, she noticed that something was wrong. Mrs. Nawaz, are you all right? Do come and sit down. Mrs. Hussain hastily vacated a nearby chair, and Mrs. Nawaz was led to it. Mrs. Khan called for some ice water. Mrs. Nawaz looked vacantly around her. They had a gun, 2 guns, she whispered flatly. They took my car, pointed one at my head. They were going to shoot. Some of the women gasped. Mrs. Hussain gently took her cold hands. Mrs. Nawaz, could you tell us what has happened? Oh, for goodness sake, woman, snap out of it. Enough of the theatrics. The loud voice of Mrs. Shirazi broke in. Mrs. Shirazi, please. The lady is in shock. Could you stay out of this? Mrs. Nawaz gulped down some water with trembling hands. There were 3 of them, waiting behind a tree. I parked my car and got out, and they came, put a gun to my head. She shuddered violently and gave a loud shrieking wail. My car! My new car! My new Toyota! Oh, what will I do? A buzz went through the group of women. There were expressions of sympathy, fear, practical advice. Have you informed anyone? The police? Your husband? Another wail. I can't. Oh, I can't. He'll kill me. He'll be so angry. He told me not to take the new car, but I did so want to show it to everyone. Give me the number. I'll call him. It must be done immediately. Oh, Mrs. Hussain, would you? Oh, my new car. Oh, what will I do? Mrs. Hussain left the room to make the phone call, and the woman started settling down. A couple of them tried to comfort the now sobbing Mrs. Nawaz. Mrs. Shirazi's entrance had been trumped. The large, over-decorated room started buzzing with conversation again. After having plied Mrs. Nawaz with a box of perfume tissues, Mrs. Khan fluttered back to her trolleys. Mrs. Nawaz, she trilled, how about some cream cake? It will make you feel better. It's very good, from the new bakery on the main street. And would you prefer tea or coffee? And you, Mrs. Shirazi, tea or coffee?